What we're, in a sense, trying to do in this conference is to discuss how effective or ineffective the referendum campaign has been so far. That obviously raises some questions about, well, how might we judge the effectiveness of the campaign? And essentially what I'm going to do is to take you through 5 possible criteria and to tell you about one that I'm not going to talk about because we're not well placed to do so. The first thing I want to talk about is, well, the first obviously way in which a referendum campaign can make a difference is that it might actually have changed the levels of support or opposition to the various propositions on the ballot paper. The second thing it might do, which I'll just look back very quickly, is, well, maybe it changes the kinds of people who are for or against independence stroke staying in the United Kingdom. Third thing then, which in a sense might be something you would expect to happen underneath if indeed we'd seen some of those changes of the first 2 kinds, is that maybe people's perceptions of the consequences of either voting yes or no might have changed. Then fourthly, something which perhaps campaigners may not be so concerned about, but academics, of course, find fascinating, is that actually one of the things that we would often expect a campaign to do is to, as what I call crystallize support, by which I mean that people's views about, for example, the consequences of independence and whether or not they're going to vote yes or no should become much more consistent with each other. In other words, voters begin to learn what the campaign is about, they begin to get a clearer idea of what the issues are at stake are, they get a firmer idea in their own mind, and therefore, as a result, the patterns become sharper and clearer. And then finally, of course, what we also might expect a campaign to do, and certainly many theories of democracy think this is pretty important, is that it should make people feel better informed about the issues at stake. The one thing I'm not going to talk about is, of course, we also expect a campaign to help to persuade people this is actually a rather important issue, that it persuades people to vote. We have asked people this year their chances of voting, but as we didn't ask it last year, we're not in a terribly good position to deal with that issue. So I'm just going to leave that to one side. I'm broadly going to take you through each of those 5 criteria one by one, but there's a kind of cadenza in the middle, which is I'm also going to do a little bit about introducing you to some questions that we didn't ask in previous years, in a sense as a kind of rain check on the validity of the conclusions I'm otherwise coming to. Okay, so first of all, has support changed for either side? We actually have 3 measures of support for independence on the SA survey. And this simply reflects the history of the survey. The first is a question that we have been asking on the survey ever since 1999, ever since the advent of devolution. It's beginning to show its age, but the great value of it is this is the only survey that has asked exactly the same question about how people think Scotland should be governed all the way through since the beginning of devolution. I'm going to simplify this question in the presentation. The first 2 options quite clearly refer to independence. The third and the fourth option clearly refer to devolution. And the fifth is, why do we have those numpties at the bottom of the Royal Mile in the first place? So I'm just going to simplify it into those 3 points. And if we look at the long-term trend, the red line is the level of the proportion of people who say devolution. The blue line is the proportion of people who say independence. And the line at the bottom is those who say that they don't want any parliament at all. Now, focusing on the blue line, support for independence on this measure is indeed up as compared with 2012. But you will also note that in 2012, support for independence was at an equal record low. And that actually, if you take the average level of support recorded for independence across the whole period from 1999 through to 2012, you discover the figure was 28%, the figure this year is 29%, from which we would broadly conclude that basically it's not clear that there's been any dramatic change in the distribution of public opinion on the basis of this measure. Second measure we've got, which is a more recent one, is in a sense designed to try and get into the issue of whether or not actually there's a body of people in Scotland who, while they might want to remain in the United Kingdom, would like rather more in the way of devolution. And we've done this by simply asking people about what should be the responsibilities of the Scottish Parliament. Should it be responsible for everything, which is code for independence? Should it be responsible for everything except for defence and foreign affairs, which is code for devolution max? And then we have an option which is designed to try and characterise broadly the status quo. And then again, the UK should be running the show. It's a different question. it's not always got the same answer. So, for example, in 2012, when we were only getting 23% support for independence on that first measure, as you can see by looking at the third column on that slide, we got 35% support on this measure. And indeed, in general, this measure historically has come up with rather high levels of support for the option that we label as independence. Intriguingly, however, this year the two figures are virtually identical. Remember, 29% on the first display. Here we've got 31%. Which is beginning to be some evidence, well, at least people evidently now clearly have perhaps a clearer understanding of what our newer question means, and that indeed, therefore, to that extent, opinion has begun to crystallize to a degree. That, of course, also means, however, that on this measure, at least, support for independence is down a little. Again, it doesn't seem that there's a really dramatic change in the distribution of public opinion. Now, what, of course, we were also able to do this year the first time, because this was the first survey to be conducted on SSA since it was clear what the referendum question was going to be. So we asked people how they were going to vote in the referendum. But the wording of this is quite important, and Jan will say more about this later on. But notice we say to people, there are two crucial things about this question. The first is we ask people how they will vote. And how will you vote in September? Not what would you do if there were to be a referendum tomorrow, which is what most of the opinion polls ask. Second thing to note is that we say to people, but maybe you haven't decided yet. So we deliberately give people the option of saying, I've not quite made my mind up yet. Then, however, if they give that last answer, I'm not quite decided, we then said to them, okay, fine, all right, what do you think you're most likely to do? So we then, to use the word in the trade, we squeeze them. So that gives us a variety of measures. Left-hand side, labelled unsqueeze, is the percentage of people who say they're going to vote yes or no, or who say they are undecided in response to that first question. And you ask it this way, you get a lot more people who are saying that they're undecided about what they're going to do. 20% say yes, 42% say no. We can then look at the distribution of support in terms of what they think they're most likely to do amongst those folk whom we regard as waverers. They're not exactly decided. That 28% of those waverers are saying, well, I'm probably going to vote yes, 34% say no. So the waverers actually look rather more sympathetic to the yes side than do those people who say they're pretty clear what they're going to do. We can then add those two groups together, so we can add those people who say they know what they are going to do to those who say that they think what they're most likely going to do, and we then get 30% support for yes, 54% for no, 16% still undecided. We can then take the undecided out of the calculation, which is what I'm encouraging the opinion pollsters to do. That gets you to, if the referendum were to be held on the basis of this survey, 36% for yes, 64% for no. And then on the far right-hand side, you can see the average level of support for yes or no on the same basis in those opinion polls that were conducted between June and October last year. And as you can see, we're slightly lower than the average, but actually we're quite similar to quite a lot of the opinion polls, particularly if you take panel basis, rather higher measures for it. But then also notice, if you just take that middle figure, we have 30% of people saying they're going to vote yes in the referendum, which is almost identical to the 29% of people who said that they were in favour of independence on a traditional measure, and the 31% on the more recent measures. So very often, because what I want to do is to look about how the campaign has changed, I'm going to tell you, I'm not going to use referendum vote directly, I'm going to use how people answered our traditional question, but it's now clear that most people give the same answer to those two questions, so therefore actually you get the same results whichever you do. Okay, very quickly, has the referendum changed the kinds of people who are more likely to be in favour of yes or no? Short answer, unambiguously no. Exhibit number 1 is the long-standing gender gap. In the latest survey, men are 6 points more likely to say they're in favour of independence than women. And that, as you can see, has been pretty much exactly what's been going on ever since the year dot. Secondly, we have tended to find pretty consistently that those in the oldest age group are less likely to be in favour, usually with the youngest age group being most in favour, but not always, and in this year certainly not quite less obviously so. But again, there aren't enormous age differences here, but such age differences they are have not evidently fundamentally changed. Again, also, there is some evidence that those folk who are in salaried middle-class occupations are a bit less keen on the idea of independence than those who are in more working-class occupations, those who are less well off. And again, that pattern is evident, but it's not an enormously striking pattern. But again, crucially, nothing has obviously changed. So, two conclusions so far. The balance of opinion has not fundamentally changed, one. And two, it hasn't really changed the kind of person who is more likely to be in favour or against. Okay, so let's have a look at underneath the bonnet. Is there anything going on underneath there? Now, obviously, this referendum in part is about identity. And one of the questions that we ask about identity is, do you feel Scottish, not British, more Scottish than British, all the way down to British, not Scottish? These are the distributions we've got on various occasions. The only slight thing to note is in 2012, we did notice there was something of a decline, at least as compared with the reading since 1999, in the proportion of people who said they were Scottish, not British. At that point, we kind of said to ourselves, that might just be the Olympics, but we weren't sure. It's still actually slightly on the low side. Whether that's anything to do with the referendum, not sure. But leaving that aside, the fundamental point here is that Scotland is overwhelmingly a society where virtually everybody feels Scottish, and for many people the Scottish identity is stronger than their British identity, and that picture has certainly not fundamentally changed. We've also been tracking people's perceptions about how good or bad a deal Scotland gets out of the Union. This is people's perceptions of whether or not Scotland gets more than or less than its fair share of public spending. One of the things we've pointed out is that since the SNP have been in power, people in Scotland have had a less critical view of the Union than they have had certainly in the early days of devolution. And as you can see, so far as Scotland's share of public spending is concerned, that pattern continues to be the case, with more or less equal numbers of people saying that Scotland gets pretty much its fair share as saying that it gets less than its fair share. So to that extent, at least, the picture again doesn't seem to have changed. So a little bit of a change on perceptions of whose economy benefits most from the Union. The blue line are those people who think it's England that benefits most. The red line, those who think it's Scotland's that benefits most. Certainly, again, views are more charitable than they were in the early years of devolution. But again, the sense that maybe England's getting a slightly better deal is, on this measure at least, become again slightly more prevalent, though we're still not back to where we were in terms of the status quo ante. And none of these changes are very dramatic. What about people's perceptions of what would happen if Scotland were to be independent? And these are questions we've now asked on quite a few occasions. You can see there the readings for 2012 and then again the readings for 2013. There's a bit of a pattern. On virtually all of these things, people's views about the consequences of independence are a little bit less favourable than they were. So, for example, last year we said 34% of people thought the economy would be better under independence. This year it's 30%. See that on the other, comparing the other rows in the same way, but it's not terribly dramatic. So again, it doesn't really look as though the referendum has had that much impact either in terms of people's views of what independence would mean. But what about crystallisation? Is it perhaps the case that although these referendum campaigns may not succeed in shifting the balance of public opinion or people's perceptions of what the consequences of independence would be, has it changed what matters to people? Now, to do this, we kind of need to have some idea of what it is we're looking for. And one of the things that we've been doing is endlessly running what we call in statistics regression models. These are essentially models which try to identify which of all these questions in this survey appear to be most clearly related to whether or not people are for or against independence. You can think of this kind of trying to engage in a sort routine. We're trying to maximize our ability to sort those people who say they're in favor of independence into one group and those who say they're opposed to independence in another group. And what I'm showing you here is what, on the basis of the research that we did on the 2011 and 2012 surveys, appeared to be the things that were most effective at sorting people into those two groups, more or less listed there in their order of importance. So as you can see, it was already the case in 2011 and 2012 that the economy looked a rather important issue. And that indeed, although national identity is also there, clearly something that matters, it certainly wasn't necessarily trumping people's economic perceptions. There were one or two other things that were as well, rather less important, though certainly, for example, people's perception that Scotland might have a stronger voice in the world was something that seemed to be batting for the yes side. What picture do we get if we do the same kind of analysis in 2013? Yep, it's still the economy stupid. National identity is there, but actually, interestingly, once you look at referendum vote, rather than our traditional measure, it kind of goes down a bit. Who benefits from the UK? Another economic measure kicks in. And then a little bit about whether Scotland's voice in the world will be stronger or weaker. It's a little bit easier to predict people's yes or no vote. Actually, the prediction is slightly better. It's slightly simpler, which kind of suggests that the referendum vote is indeed crystallising issues. But notice there's a remarkable similarity here. So in terms of what matters, it's not obvious that things have changed. But maybe the things that mattered matter even more. And here's a way of beginning to look at this. Here, first of all, is why essentially the statistical routine is picking out people's perceptions of the economic consequences of independence as being a good sorting machine. Because if you think that Scotland's economy would be a lot better on independence, you are almost bound to vote to say you're in favour of independence and to say you're going to vote yes. Contrarily, if you think that it's going to be an absolute basket case economically, if Scotland becomes independent, you ain't going to vote. So very, very clear, strong relationship. What then, however, is interesting is if we compare those patterns with what we were finding in 2011 and 2012. So as you can see, back in 2012, if you thought the economy would be a lot better under independence, yeah, you were pretty likely to vote independence, but we were getting around 3/4 of that group saying they were going to vote for independence. Now we're getting 88%. Notice those folk who think it would be a little better now are much more clearly in favour of independence, but equally at the other end of the spectrum, such support as there was is, if anything, even a little bit weaker insofar as it's actually possible. So almost undoubtedly, and this is what the statistical sausage machine tells us, not only is the economy important, not only has the economy always been important, but actually it's even more important. Contrarily, whether or not people feel Scottish rather than British or not, yes, it matters. You can see here that if you say you're Scottish, not British, you're more likely to vote. But it doesn't seem to be any more important now than it was a year ago. So national identity matters, but it's not something which evidently is being more evidently translated into support for independence now than it was previously. Meanwhile, you can see why which economy people think matters more. Matters, again, it sorts people quite well. And again, it looks as though probably it's sorting a little bit better than it did a year ago. And again, much is also true so far as people's perception of whether Scotland would have a stronger voice in the world. So one thing the campaign does look as though it's done is to have succeeded to a degree in crystallising people's views. And to that extent, at least, the referendum does seem to have done something. But then you may be saying to yourself, well, hang on, that's not that many questions to test about the consequences of independence. You know, there are lots of things you've not talked about, bailing out the banks, whether or not, would Scotland, independent Scotland, be able to defend itself effectively against terrorism? What about more money for public services? So we decided to widen the basket this year. So let me just quickly go through this. So very similar structure of questions. What do you think would happen as a result of independence? And again, you get a picture. You don't get a picture of, of people dramatically thinking it's going to make a difference. Equally, for the most part, you don't get a picture of thinking it's going to make things disastrous. Though undoubtedly, when it comes to dealing with terrorism or being able to bail out the customers of a failing bank, there does seem to be a degree of concern about the consequence of independence inside the Scottish public. Equally, meanwhile, people seem to be more or less balanced about whether or not they feel confident that Scotland actually has the skills to govern itself. So there's nothing obviously decisive going on here. How far, however, do these things also make a difference to whether or not people are going to vote yes or no or not? To which the answer is yes to a degree, but which is the one that comes out as most strongly related? Well, it's actually a question about whether or not you think your personal finances would be better or worse under independence. As you can see, if you think your personal finance is a lot better, 89% level of support. And again, if people think Scotland has the skills to govern, you're also likely to be in favour. So what we can then do, we can take these additional measures and say to our sorting machine, well, should we be including any of these? To which the answer is yes to a degree. The additions are highlighted in red. What comes out most? Personal finances. So it's another economic issue. So it's not that we're missing things, it's just simply actually that we're measuring rather better, which takes us to the £500 question. Okay. If people think that they would be £500 a year better off, 52% say they would support independence. If in contrast they thought they'd be £500 worse off, only 15% say they support independence. So the point is, I mean, this rather hypothetical measure is actually underpinned and is reflecting a process that is already going on. Crucial point, however, is first that actually support for independence is now somewhat lower, even if people think that they would be 500 quid better off. And to that extent, at least, as it were, it looks as though this now works a little less effectively for the yes side than you might previously anticipated. Okay, finally, because I can see Brian beginning to get nervous, we might want this campaign to make voters feel more confident about what independence would bring. We asked a question last year and this year, how sure are you as to what would happen if Scotland were to become an independent country? Answer, not very sure, still not very sure, and if anything, a little bit less sure than we were 12 months ago. Does this matter? Yes, it certainly matters for the yes side, because if we divide folk up into whether they feel sure or unsure, and then look separately for those two groups, their probability of being in favour of independence, according to their views as to whether or not they think the economy is going to be better or worse, what you discovered last year, what you discovered this year, is that if you think the economy will be better, but in general you're not too sure what's going to happen as a result of independence, you seem to be less willing to say that you're in favour of independence and are going to vote yes. So that sense of uncertainty is undoubtedly a disadvantage to the yes side. The other thing which is also quite clear is that there is still a feeling in Scotland, although people don't necessarily think that independence, when you ask them specific questions about specific areas, think independence is going to be a disaster, ask them whether or not they feel confident or worried about Scotland becoming independent, and they say, you know what, we're still a little bit worried about it. And that, again, has not really changed. Okay, so my conclusion is that, for the most part, this seems to have been a pretty ineffective debate. On at least 4 of the 5 criteria that I've outlined, it has not really succeeded in changing things. The one thing that it may have done to a degree is to help to crystallise public opinion. To that extent, at least, some people's views are now sharper. But we are still talking about a public which, when you ask them, well, how sure are you about the consequences of all of this, they're still saying, well, we'd quite like to know a little bit more, please.